Why did we invent clocks that went up to 12 instead of 24? Probably because sundials only track time during the day. Also, a 24-hour clock would look very crowded. Some clocks in Italy in the old days only went up to 6, and then you would just mentally add 6 hours after that based on context. The mechanisms were easier to build. Building on the bell tower point, it's worth noting that a 12-hour system was far more practical for the majority who couldn't afford personal timekeeping devices. Everyone relied on public signals like those bells, thus, a simpler system meant it was accessible and understandable for all. Gearing society towards a 24-hour clock would likely have been met with confusion and resistance. In essence, the 12-hour cycle not only made sense with natural light patterns, but also with the social dynamics of the time. Because before the invention of pocket watches, time was announced by the local bell tower. Imagine having to hear the bell ring 18 times in the evening and you trying to count with your fingers. Because you can divide 12 by 2, 3 and 4. And when sundials were invented, decimal system wasn't invented yet. Also, https://catherinehanley.co.uk historical background time in the 13th century catherinehanley.co.uk historical background time in the 13th century hours. This is where things can go most wrong. We are used to our structured, scheduled days of 24 hours split with precision into minutes and seconds, but to those in the early 13th century this would have been an alien concept. Think about it. In a world with no clocks or watches, how would you divide time so precisely? It's just not possible, and people didn't try. Instead, a day in the 13th century consisted of 12 hours which ran from sunrise to sunset, meaning that an hour could be longer or shorter depending on the time of year. Sex the 6th hour was at noon. The day was further subdivided by terce the 3rd hour mid-morning, and nuns the 9th hour mid-afternoon. No one got the time. There are some analog wrist watches with 24-hour clock face. 24-hour clock faces have existed basically since the invention of mechanical clocks. 12-hour systems put midday at the top in the center, which is a solar-centric convention. Sun is directly overhead. Zero starting systems are a convention of the mid to late 19th century. It still makes a lot of sense to put the peak at the top and the anti-peak at the bottom of ho. Technically, you could make an 8-hour clock and divide the day into thirds. Interestingly, the 12-hour clock also aligns neatly with the human body's circadian rhythm, which splits our perception of day into two distinct phases, active and rest. Our ancestors may not have had the scientific understanding of this cycle, but their decision to adopt a dual-phase system certainly mirrors it, reinforcing the natural order in a way that a 24-hour dial might have disrupted. Plus, it's much easier to mentally have the day into morning and afternoon than to divide it into 24 increments. I'm more upset that our day starts at 12 a.m. instead of 1 a.m. Because a foot is only 12 inches. Every day is 2 feet long. Can you imagine how strange a 2-foot ruler would look? Might as well get a yardstick. Nate can only count to 5. It will be a lot harder to read at a glance, and people don't go around life wondering whether it's 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. 24 hours seems useless since you would pretty much only ever look at your 12 hours when you were up and awake. It would be scrunched. And yes, like sundials, a 24-hour clock doesn't translate to how the clock faces actually work. For digital, it's whatever. I designed my own watch faces for my smartwatch, and the current face I'm using, I made to have a 24-hour dial and just have a number readout for minutes in the center. Kind cool that the hour hand only goes once around the clock a day. Imagine how crowded that would look. I think a more interesting question I have is, why did they make 12 months out of a year that 2 having different days? They could have made a month for every season or something else. Because if clocks went up to 24, they'd have to be twice as big. Before medieval times, day and night were each divided into 12 hours. Their length would vary over the seasons if you lived away from the equator. After mechanical clocks, it was easier to use even hours. I presume even hours made it easier to price labor and commerce.